All right, let's look at the heart valves in more detail. So the heart valves ensure unidirectional blood flow through the heart. And if you watch the first part of chapter 17, part A, you probably have gotten that indication thus far. We've talked about blood entering the atria, then flowing through an AV valve, then to the ventricles, then out the top of the heart via the semilunar valves and entering into arteries. Now, that's a unidirectional blood flow, and now we're establishing that it's always unidirectional, that blood should not backflow, that it should always go atria, ventricles, major arteries, passing through AV and semilunar valves therein. Now, the valves that we're about to talk about open and close in response to pressure changes. And there's two major types of valves. It's the AV, or atrioventricular valves, and the semilunar valves. The two atrioventricular valves are located between atria and ventricles. The one on the right is the tricuspid valve, and the one on the left is the mitral valve. The mitral valve is also known as the bicuspid valve. The two semilunar valves are located between ventricles and the major arteries, and they are the pulmonic on the right, or sometimes called the pulmonary valve, and the aortic valve on the left. Now, there's no valves found between major veins and atria, but that's not really a problem. The blood flow has such force coming into the heart that prevents backflow. Now, it's not a tremendous amount of energy, but it is enough inertia to prevent that backflow. And then there's heart contractions, mainly from the hard pumping chambers, the ventricles, that compress the venous openings. Here we're looking at a superior view of the heart, so we can see, because of the way it was sectioned, the tricuspid valve, mitral valve, both AV valves, and the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. Those are both semilunar valves. Both semilunar valves have three cusps, and these three cusps are going to be situated in such a way that they appear like tiny half moons, hence the name semilunar valve. The mitral valve is also known as the bicuspid valve because it contains two cusps, and the tricuspid valve, hence the name, contains three cusps. So the atrioventricular valves, again, you can abbreviate this AV, they're going to be able to prevent backflow into the atria. Again, they're separating atria from ventricles, and blood should flow from the atria then to the ventricles. And the way that these valves are shaped, blood is actually unable to, as the ventricles contract, to backflow into the atria. So it's important to know first the anatomy. So AV valves separate atria from ventricles. We need to know that the right AV valve is the tricuspid valve, and the left AV valve is the mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid valve. If that's kind of messing you up, if you're looking over heart anatomy and you know what is the base of the heart, what's the apex, you got left versus right side, but which valve goes where when you're just trying to remember or recall, there is kind of a little trick. There's a saying, you want to try it before you buy it. The reason this saying goes that way is when we teach blood flow through the heart, we tend to start at the right atrium. So if you remember the kind of arbitrary starting point for blood flow through the heart, the right side, and then you remember the phrase, you want to try it before you buy it, the first prefix is try. The second one is buy. So that means we start on the right side, and the first valve we encounter is the tricuspid, so that must be the right AV valve. Then in the phrase, the next prefix we encounter is the bicuspid, so that must be what's left over, the left side. Now, that's why it's important to know that the mitral valve is also known as the bicuspid valve. Again, we must mention the chordae tendineae, or heartstrings, which anchor the cusp of the AV valves to papillary muscles. So the superior part of the chordae tendineae is anchored to the cusp of the AV valves, but the inferior part is anchored to papillary muscles. And these papillary muscles function to hold the flaps in a closed position and prevent them from everting back into the atria. So it is important to know those two functions for the chordae tendineae and how they're attached to papillary muscles. We can see in this image, figure 17.6 C through D, that the chordae tendineae are between the cusp and the papillary muscle. And then we can see over here kind of just where they would be located. So cusp, chordae tendineae, papillary muscle. Papillary muscles in the ventricle. Chordae tendineae connect to the cusp, which is separating the atria from the ventricle. So let's talk now that we've established some anatomy about the function of the atrioventricular valves. So blood enters the atria as it returns to the heart, and this presses into the cusp of the AV valves. It presses into the cusp on the superior surface, and that pressure is actually able to force the atrioventricular valves open. That would then allow the blood to leave the atria and flow passively into the ventricles. But as the ventricles fill, they start to exert pressure on the underside of the atrioventricular valve. This pressure increases even further when the ventricles contract. So when the ventricles contract, we force that blood that was already putting pressure on the underside of the AV valve up against the AV valve, and that actually pushes the AV valve cusp together and closes the AV valve. The papillary muscles keep the AV valves from everting or going back into the atria, thereby basically making them kind of a swinging door, but they're kept from being in that swinging door because of the chordae tendineae, the heartstrings attached to the papillary muscles. So that was the AV valves. Next, we're going to move in and look at the semilunar valves. So first, some anatomy about the semilunar valves. There's two of them. We know there is the pulmonic or pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve. We know that semilunar valves are going to separate the ventricles from major arteries, but they're also preventing backflow from major arteries back into the ventricles. Remember, blood flow is unidirectional. So they're also going to open and close in response to pressure changes, and each valve is going to consist of 3 cusps that we saw in that last slide. The pulmonary semilunar valve is located on the right side of the heart, and the aortic semilunar valve is located on the left side of the heart. So the pulmonary semilunar valve is separating the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Keep in mind the pulmonary trunk separates into a left and right pulmonary artery, and the aortic semilunar valve is separating the left ventricle from the aorta. The way that semilunar valves work is as the ventricles begin contracting, and they're not only putting pressure on the underside of AV valves, they also begin putting pressure on other locations nearby or adjacent to the ventricles. Because of the shape of the semilunar valves, as opposed to the AV valves, when this pressure is exerted on their underside, they open. So as ventricles contract and the interventricular pressure rises, blood is actually going to be pushed up and it can't go back into the atria, so instead it forces the semilunar valves open and blood enters the major arteries. Then as the ventricles relax, some of the blood that entered the major arteries will try to backflow. But because of the function and structure of the semilunar valves, it's going to prevent backflow of blood into the ventricles because the cusps actually simply just fill with blood and are pushed close. There are 2 conditions we just want to mention that severely weaken the heart. They essentially weaken the heart by making the heart repump blood. When the heart has to repump blood, it expends extra ATP that it doesn't really have to expend. And it makes the heart very inefficient and kind of lag down, and sometimes cardiomegaly or an enlarged heart can occur because the heart was really trying to kind of compensate for overpumping blood or having to repump blood. And you'll see this kind of enlargement of the myocardium, but it does it so quickly that the heart becomes a little flabby. So these 2 conditions are going to be defective valves. One is an incompetent valve, which happens when blood backflows, so the heart just repumps the same blood over and over. The other is valvular stenosis, which occurs when there are stiff flaps that constrict opening. And the reason you might have a stiff atrioventricular flap, for example, could be because of atherosclerosis and plaque buildup that's made it into the heart and kind of deposit itself on one of the valves. And both of these would require the heart to exert more force in order to pump blood, either for the first time because of this extra pressure or stiff flaps, or because it's repumping blood. But either way, a defective valve can be replaced with a mechanical animal or cadaver valve if it's caught in time. All right, and that's it for that video. We are going to move next time and look at the pathway of blood through the heart it is paramount that before you watch that video that you understand the anatomy of the heart, that you're comfortable with the chambers and the base and the apex and some of the major arteries and veins that you can see just adjacent to the heart before we get into kind of the major arteries and veins that lead to the pulmonary and systemic circuit.